What is up, people? Welcome back, and welcome to the granddaddy of all review videos. In this video, I'm going to go over everything you need to know for the entire AP exam, so let's get right to it. And hey, as that music's playing, go ahead and smash that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Okay, so I have timestamps for the units in the description if you want to jump to something specific. And I also want to remind you that I have videos reviewing each unit as well as the cases and the documents, so if you haven't watched those yet, I strongly encourage you to do so, because this will be much less detail-oriented than those videos. And last thing before we start is I want to remind you about the Ultimate Review Packet. It really has everything you need to get ready for the exam, including great study guides, tons of practice questions, 3 full-length practice exams, everything to help you feel confident before this exam. Alright, Unit 1 is Foundations of American Democracy. We'll start with the Declaration of Independence, which contains 3 ideals of democracy. When Jefferson said that all men are endowed with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, he's describing what we call natural rights, that there are rights we enjoy simply by being human. Jefferson continues on, saying that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. This is the social contract, which suggests the purpose of government is to protect people's natural rights. And then Jefferson says that government derives its power from the consent of the governed, and that people have the right to abolish and establish governments. And this is popular sovereignty, that people are the source of governmental power. Our other main founding document, the US Constitution, helps us with the other 2 ideals. It sets up a limited government, meaning that the federal government only has the powers granted to it by the Constitution. Additionally, it sets up a republican form of government, which means that rather than people voting on laws, people vote for representatives who will then vote on the laws and make the policies. So the US has a representative democracy, and there are 3 models that attempt to describe this type of democracy. Participatory democracy emphasizes broad citizen participation in politics and civil society, allowing as many people as possible to have an influence on public policy. It's focused on the individual. Pluralist democracy focuses on the role of group-based activism, such as interest groups and political parties, and these groups compete for power and influence over policy. Elite democracy suggests a more limited or filtered role for individuals, like when people vote for representatives instead of voting on policies, or with the Electoral College when people vote for electors instead of actually voting directly on the president. Along with debates over the type of democracy the Constitution set up, there's also debate over the balance of governmental power and individual rights, and we can highlight that debate through 2 of our required documents. In Federalist Number 10, James Madison argued that the biggest threat to nation was factions, and that in democracies, majority factions would tyrannize the minority. His solution was a large republic, a representative government that would limit the power of the majority, as well as a federal system that divides power between the state and national government. An anti-federalist paper, Brutus No. 1, argued in favor of democracy and local control over policies, wanting people to have as much power as possible, and warning about potential destruction of liberty that would take place as a result of the overly strong government set up by the new Constitution. Speaking of the Constitution, we know that it wasn't the first attempt at setting up a national government. Before that came the Articles of Confederation, which was based on the principle of state sovereignty, where states had the ultimate authority over themselves. It delegated a few specific powers to the national government, like the power to declare war, make treaties, borrow money, and create currency, but there was only a legislative branch. It had no enforcement powers, it couldn't regulate interstate commerce, and importantly, it couldn't tax. When Shays' Rebellion occurred, the response left a lot to be desired, and helped shift public opinion in favor of expanding the power of the national government through a new constitution. The Constitution itself is largely the result of a series of compromises, and we'll talk about 4 of them here. The Great Compromise established a bicameral legislature, in which the House of Representatives would be based off population, and the Senate represents states equally. There was also debate over how to select the president, with the compromise being that the Electoral College would select the president, and that each state would decide for itself how to choose its members of the Electoral College. There's also the infamous 3/5 Compromise, which decided that slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person for apportioning the House and Electoral College, and this led to Southern states being overrepresented in the House and the presidency over the first 70 years of the nation's history. And 4th was the compromise on the importation of slaves, which basically meant that they agreed that the slave trade could not be abolished for 20 years, again, this compromise being the only way to secure Southern support for the Constitution. In Article 5, the Constitution set up an amendment process so that changes could be made in the future, but not too easily. The primary method requires 2/3 of both houses of Congress to propose an amendment, followed by 3/4 of the states to ratify. The Federalists supported the new Constitution and a stronger central government, while the Anti-Federalists opposed the Constitution, and they advocated for states' rights, and they demanded the inclusion of a Bill of Rights. The framers of the Constitution were very concerned about how much power the federal government would have, so they created a system with separation of powers, allocating different jobs to the three branches of the national government. The legislative branch makes laws, the executive enforces laws, and the judiciary interprets laws. Additionally, checks and balances allow each branch to have certain ways to influence or limit the other branches. In Federalist number 51, Madison argued that this was necessary because while we need to have a government, we also need to make sure that government doesn't have too much power, and one way to do that was to separate their powers and then make sure that they each have some influence over the others. More on this later. Additionally, the Constitution set up federalism, the division of powers between the states and the national government. We often describe this as dynamic federalism because the specific balance of power between states and the national government has changed over time. Speaking in extremely broad strokes, the trend has been that the national government has gained more power while states have declined in influence, but there are exceptions. Before we get to that though, let's get a little bit vocab. Delegated powers are powers that the Constitution gave to the national government, allowing it to do specific things like coining money, declaring war, and regulating interstate commerce. These are powers that belong only to the national government. The 10th Amendment reminds us that there are reserved powers. Everything not delegated to the national government or denied to the states is reserved to the states. So there isn't a list in the Constitution, but basically everything that's left over, including things like a general police power, education, health, welfare, and licensing. And concurrent powers are executed by both states and the national government. They can both raise taxes and borrow money, for example. For citizens, this creates an interesting situation where there are multiple levels of government over us, and depending what the particular issue is, we might have to listen to the national government, other times to the states, and sometimes to both. In the past, that relationship could be described as dual or layer cake federalism, where there was a pretty clear line between whether something was a national or a state issue. States and the national government remain superior and supreme in their own spheres of influence. But throughout the progressive era and culminating with the New Deal during FDR's presidency, we saw a shift to cooperative or marble cake federalism, where the lines between state and national responsibility become blurred, and where administration and the cost of major programs begin to be shared. Remember when I mentioned that things like education, health, and welfare are reserved to the states? Well, then how do we have programs like Social Security, Medicare, or No Child Left Behind? There's two basic explanations for the massive increase in national power: money and changes in the way we interpret the Constitution. So let's follow the money. There are basically four different ways that money has gone from the national government to state governments. So first up are categorical grants, which provide money to states for a specific purpose. The states get the money, but Congress tells the states specifically how to spend that money. Additionally, Congress often includes incentives or conditions of aid that states must follow in order to qualify to receive the money. When Reagan wanted to raise the drinking age to 21, the national government made doing so a condition to receive money for transportation. Technically, states had the option to say yes or no, but you guys are 18, so you tell me what every state chose to do. States prefer to receive block grants because the money is for a broader purpose, so they have more discretion but not total freedom over how the money gets spent. Until the late 80s, there used to be something known as federal revenue sharing, which states liked even more because this provided money to the states that they could spend however they wanted with no strings attached. But this program ended decades ago. On the other end of the spectrum are funded and unfunded mandates. This is where the national government establishes rules that states have to follow, and they may or may not provide money for implementation. But either way, here the states have no option. Big picture from this section, grants have helped shift the balance of power towards the national government as they are now able to influence policy areas that are outside of its constitutional purview. The other major cause for this shift deals with a few key constitutional clauses. The Supremacy Clause tells us that when there's a conflict between states and the national law and Constitution are superior. There's also the Necessary and Proper Clause, that last line in Article 1, Section 8 that basically says, oh yeah, and Congress can do other stuff, as long as it's necessary and proper for carrying out their enumerated powers. Enumerated powers are the ones that are directly written down, but with this clause, Congress also has implied powers, expanding their power. And both of these clauses come up in McCulloch versus Maryland. The Necessary and Proper Clause means that Congress can create a national bank even though the Constitution doesn't specifically say they can. And states can't tax the national government because the Supremacy Clause says the national government is superior. To round out our big three of constitutional clauses, we have the Commerce Clause, which allows Congress to regulate interstate commerce. Importantly, this has been reinterpreted to allow Congress to regulate anything affecting interstate commerce, and therefore is a major cause in the expansion of federal power. Our required case, U.S. v. Lopez, provides an exception though, because in this 1995 case, for the first time in 60 years, the court struck down a federal law establishing that there is a limit to Congress's power under the Commerce Clause, and they reaffirmed that the 10th Amendment does reserve some powers to the states. Okay, and that's Unit 1, so now let's get right to Unit 2 and focus on the branches of the national government. First up, Congress. Okay, we know that the main power of Congress is to pass legislation, and we also know that it's divided into the House and Senate, so let's get into some of the key differences between the House and the Senate. The House represents the people, is based on population, and has 435 members who each serve 2-year terms, while the Senate was designed to represent states, and each state has 2 senators, so there are 100 members total, and they serve 6-year terms. The enumerated powers of Congress include passing a federal budget, taxation, coining money, declaring war, and maintaining the armed forces. Implied powers allow them to enact legislation on economic, environmental, and social issues based on the necessary and proper clause. Let's briefly talk about leadership in the House and the Senate. The Speaker of the House is the most powerful person in the House and is always from the majority party, while the leader of the Senate is known as the Senate Majority Leader. The Vice President is officially the President of the Senate, but only has one power, and that's to cast tie-breaking votes. Both the House and the Senate make use of committee systems. Standing committees are permanent committees, where most of the work in Congress takes place. We're talking here about things like holding hearings, discussing and revising, editing bills, as well as providing oversight on the implementation of legislation that's already been passed. The committee chair is always from the majority party. Then there's conference committees, which are a type of joint committee, so they include both members of the House and the Senate. When the House and Senate pass different versions of the same bill, it goes to a conference committee, which then attempts to come up with some kind of compromise version of the bill that can be passed by both houses and then sent to the president. But the House and Senate differ significantly in how they're structured. Since the House is so large, it's more formal, with a lot more rules. For example, there's a germaneness requirement, which means that all speeches on the floor must be on topic to the bill at hand, and there's a time limit for how long members can speak. Additionally, there's the House Rules Committee, an extra step in the process of a bill becoming a law, and this committee can make rules for floor debate, including whether amendments can be added to a bill or not. The House also has discharge petitions, which require a majority vote of the whole House, which can then force a bill out of committee so that it can be reviewed by the entire House. It can form itself into a committee of the whole, which can help to facilitate the passage of legislation quickly. The Senate is much less formal. For example, there's no germaneness requirement, there's no time limit for debate, and this opens the door to something known as a filibuster. Long speech that's designed to prevent a bill from being voted on. This is usually a tactic of the minority party and can prevent legislation that has majority support from passing. It only requires a simple majority to pass legislation in both the House and the Senate, but it requires a 3/5 supermajority to invoke cloture and end debate on the bill. And you should probably know that these days senators just need to announce their intention to filibuster as opposed to actually doing it, so it serves as a major obstacle in the lawmaking process. Senators can also issue holds, which basically function like a silent filibuster and serve to prevent a bill from being discussed or voted upon. While holds and filibusters slow down the process, it can pass unanimous consent agreements, which can expedite and speed up passage of routine legislation. Congress has the power of the purse, and one important part of this power is to create an annual budget with 2 types of spending. Discretionary spending refers to spending that is authorized annually by Congress for things like defense and education spending, which can be set as high or as low as they want to do each year. On the other hand, mandatory spending refers to spending that is required by law to take place. So Congress and the President don't set a budget for this kind of spending. The largest area of mandatory spending is on entitlement programs. These are things like Social Security and Medicare, where people are entitled to certain benefits based on the rules of those programs. And about 70% of federal spending is considered mandatory, and this number continues to grow as boomers get older and retire. This reduces the opportunity to increase discretionary spending on other things unless tax revenues are raised or budget deficits are increased. Safe to say, politicians have chosen budget deficits. There's also pork barrel legislation, which refers to laws that provide tangible benefits like jobs or money for a representative's district, and then help that representative get reelected. And log rolling refers to vote trading by members of Congress. You vote for the stuff that I want for my district, and I'll vote for the stuff for your district that I couldn't care less about. Democracy in action. Along the same lines, there's different views regarding how much freedom congressmen are given by their constituents. The delegate model is the idea that the representative should follow public opinion of his constituents, even if he or she personally disagrees, whereas the trustee role suggests that a member is free to vote how she thinks is best, even if her constituents disagree. A third option, Politico, is a blend of both, wherein a representative can usually feel free to use her own judgment, but at certain times is compelled to follow the public opinion of her constituents. But what about how congressmen get into office? Now, obviously they're elected by people in their districts or state, but let's focus on House elections and how those districts get determined in the first place. There are 435 seats in the House, apportioned based on population. So every 10 years following the census, reapportionment takes place, changing the number of seats each state has in the House, with some states gaining and other states losing seats. Following that, it's up to each state legislature to redraw the congressional district's map for their state, a process known as redistricting. There's only a few rules they have to follow. One is from the court's ruling in Baker v. Carr, which allowed the court to review redistricting plans in accord with the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, and based on the one person, one vote principle, requires that districts be roughly the same size. Despite that ruling, state legislatures are still free to engage in partisan gerrymandering, drawing districts in bizarre shapes to benefit their party. In a 1993 case, Shaw v. Reno, the court said that racial gerrymandering is unconstitutional, even if the district is being drawn based on race in order to increase minority representation. Elections sometimes have led to divided government, which just means that the House, Senate, and the presidency are not all controlled by the same party. When that happens, it's known as unified government. It's obviously more difficult to get things done during periods of divided government, which often tends to lead to something known as legislative gridlock. It leads to partisan votes against presidential initiatives or refusal by the Senate to confirm appointments by presidents from the opposite party. In recent decades, we've seen more and more instances of this, as well as an increase in party polarization as the two parties grow further apart from each other ideologically, which again contributes to this problem of gridlock. On that note, let's turn our attention to the presidency. The president is the head of the executive branch, whose job is to enforce laws made by Congress. The role of the president has expanded since the founding, but for now, let's start with some of the formal and informal powers of the president. We find the formal powers in Article 2 of the Constitution, and there really isn't too much there, surprisingly. The president's role in legislation is that she can sign the bill into law or she can veto it. A veto is a message to Congress with her reasons for rejecting it. Congress can override the veto with a 2/3 vote in both houses, but this has only happened about 4% of the time, so this is a very strong check the president has on Congress. There's also the pocket veto, which means that the president takes no action, and if the session of Congress ends within 10 days of sending the bill to the president, then it does not become a law. Otherwise, if Congress is in session, it becomes a law without the president's signature. The president is also commander-in-chief of the armed forces, meaning she is in charge of overseeing the branches of the military and directing troop movements. You'll recall that only Congress can declare war, so this is a good example of separation of powers. The president is also allowed to make treaties with foreign nations, though these treaties need to be ratified by the Senate, and just ask Woodrow Wilson how easy that is. Presidents also have informal powers in foreign policy, like the ability to make executive agreements, which are essentially treaties except they don't require Senate confirmation. So they're more convenient for presidents to get into, but they're also really easy for the next president to exit from. Like how the US joined the Paris Climate Accord, then it left, now it's back, and it'll probably leave again in a couple years. Presidents are also very dependent on bargaining and persuasion because there's not really much they can do by themselves, so they have to convince somebody, Congress usually, to go along with them. This might include bargaining over things like appointments, budgets, and legislative priorities. And it can also involve presidents attempting to persuade the public, who could then put pressure on their members of Congress to cooperate with the president. Additionally, presidents often issue signing statements when signing a bill into law that gives the president's interpretation of the bill and provides instructions to the executive agencies that are in charge of implementing that law. And lastly, executive orders are a major policy tool for presidents, since these allow her to make policy that has the force of law and doesn't require congressional approval. Now, this does not mean the president can rule by executive order, though, as their purpose is to enforce laws made by Congress. So if they're in conflict with laws or the Constitution, they can be struck down. Most commonly, they're used to direct the bureaucracy and in foreign policy, where presidents do have very broad discretion. But in most areas of domestic policy, the president is heavily reliant on Congress, and therefore there are many opportunities for tension and confrontation, especially with the Senate. For one, when it comes to positions that the president nominates and the Senate confirms, such as federal judges, cabinet secretaries, ambassadors, and the heads of executive agencies. This is different from positions within the White House office that don't require Senate confirmation, such as the President's Chief of Staff, Press Secretary, and advisors. Judicial appointments, including Supreme Court justices, are especially noteworthy and fraught with tension, though, because as we'll soon review, these often represent a president's longest lasting influence since they serve life terms. As mentioned earlier, presidential power has clearly expanded since the passage of the Constitution. In Federalist Number 70, Alexander Hamilton made the case for a single unitary executive, arguing that it was necessary for the executive to be able to quickly respond in moments of disaster or war, and that public opinion would actually be a stronger check on a single executive than on a plural or group executive, because at least we'd all know who to blame or who to credit for a situation. Today, some argue for even more expansive interpretations of presidential power and a stronger executive, while others advocate for a more limited role closer to what's outlined in the Constitution. And by the way, after FDR won the presidency for approximately the 19th time, this 22nd Amendment was ratified, limiting presidents to serve only 2 terms. One of the major changes in the presidency in recent years has to do with changes in communication technology. Yep, I'm talking about social media, which allows presidents to communicate directly with the public and to be less reliant on traditional news media. The bully pulpit refers to the fact that because she's the president, this position allows the president to speak out on any issue she wants, and whatever she says is automatically newsworthy. She can use this to try to help push her policy agenda. Similarly, the State of the Union address is a nationally televised speech delivered to Congress, and the president here tries to use this to gain support for her agenda and pressure Congress into supporting those priorities. Next, we're going to stay in the executive branch and talk about the bureaucracy, which is made up of several million people who do the day-to-day job of enforcing laws and providing government services. These people are known alternately as bureaucrats and civil servants, and since the reforms of the merit system, they've been hired because they qualify for the job, not as part of a political patronage system. While the vast majority of bureaucrats are non-political, the heads of many agencies and departments are chosen politically, being nominated by the president and subject to Senate confirmation. So the workers, non-political. Their bosses, super political. Awkward. Now, there are 4 types of bureaucratic agencies, and we'll go in order from most to least significant. Cabinet departments are the big guys. There's only 17 of them, and they have authority over a broad area of policy. Things like justice, defense, treasury. Again, big picture power. Then there's independent regulatory commissions, which sometimes fall underneath the cabinet department, and they have a narrow area of responsibility, usually a particular industry that the agency oversees and regulates. There are also independent executive agencies, which have a frustratingly similar name, but these agencies are often trying to achieve some policy goal, such as the EPA attempting to reduce pollution or the CFPB protecting consumers. Both are independent in the sense that they have some independence from the president and from the cabinet departments, and the president may not be able to fire or remove the top-level administrators. The idea here is that this frees up decision makers at these independent agencies to do what they believe is best, not what is politically expedient. Lastly, government corporations like Amtrak and the Postal Service basically function like a private company providing a service that isn't provided by the private sector, typically because it's something that's not profitable. Here's the important part. Long story short, Congress passes legislation but lacks the time, expertise, and ability to be involved in all the details. So they tell a particular agency or department to implement the law and then fill in the details for them. So Congress passes the Clean Air Act and then gives the EPA the discretionary authority to figure out how best to achieve the goals set out in that law. Along with this, they're also given rulemaking authority. So the regulations made by the agencies have the power of law even though they weren't made by Congress. Not only that, but the agencies also have the power to enforce the regulations they've made. So as a result, some people believe that these agencies comprised of unelected bureaucrats have too much power since they aren't accountable to the electorate, and yet they have this regulatory authority. They are subject to numerous checks and balances though, such as judicial review and the presidential executive orders that change the priorities of agencies. But the most significant check by far is congressional oversight, which allows a congressional committee to check up on the agency and ensure that its actions please members of Congress, including investigations, requiring the heads of these agencies to testify at hearings. If Congress doesn't like what they hear, they can use their power of the purse to reduce the agency's budget or even abolish the agency altogether. Okay, and our final branch, the judiciary. Article 3 of the Constitution barely says anything about it, but today this branch has grown into something significant and powerful. Let's start with what Hamilton said about the judiciary way back in Federalist number 78. There he argued that the Constitution established an independent judiciary, with judges serving life terms that would be free to strike down laws that were contrary to the Constitution. And that last part became official policy in Marbury versus Madison, the OG of all cases, when the court established judicial review, saying that it had the power to strike down laws and executive actions that were unconstitutional. What a boss move. Of course, the fact that the Constitution doesn't explicitly mention judicial review, and the fact that the court gave themselves this power, and that they aren't elected, this can lead to some people questioning the legitimacy of the court's power. Compounding this is the fact that the court lacks the ability to enforce its rulings, so it's in a situation where it has to be careful not to stray too far from what's politically acceptable. Federal judges, including Supreme Court justices, are nominated by presidents and are subject to Senate confirmation, and presidents attempt to nominate justices who are ideologically similar to themselves. At times when the ideology of the court's majority shifts, we may see the court overturning old and establishing new precedents. A precedent is a past ruling that influences future decisions and tells other federal judges how to rule on similar issues. Courts often follow the legal principle stare decisis, let the decision stand, which means to follow precedent. But the Supreme Court is free to ignore that and establish new precedents. If a ruling is particularly controversial or unpopular, the president may refuse to implement it or vow to nominate justices who would undo that decision. Additionally, Congress can change the jurisdiction of the court and not allow it to rule on that issue anymore, or could vote to increase the number of justices on the court in hopes of changing the ideology of the court's majority. The strongest check, though, is to propose a constitutional amendment, which, if ratified, would nullify the court's holding. Sometimes it might be as simple as passing a modified version of a law that was struck down to make sure that it satisfies the court's objection, like when Congress updated the Gun-Free School Zones Act to ban guns that were part of interstate commerce after they took an L in U.S. versus Lopez. So what's the proper role for the judiciary? Advocates of judicial restraint argue that since justices are unelected, they should defer to the democratically elected branches and only strike down legislation that is clearly unconstitutional. Others argue for judicial activism, wherein the justices are empowered to strike down laws they believe are unconstitutional. That term, though, is often used by critics of a decision who are implying that the court overstepped its proper place. But Hamilton said we needed a judiciary that would defend the Constitution from encroachments by Congress and the president. So maybe they're the heroes we need, but not the heroes we deserve? I don't know. Alright, still with me? I know we're flying, but let's keep going. Unit 3, Civil Liberties and Civil Rights. Now, when I say civil liberties, I'm talking about personal individual freedoms governments can't take away. We primarily find a list of protected civil liberties in the Bill of Rights, which doesn't guarantee that we have certain rights, but rather says there are certain things the federal government can't do. So let's blast through these. Ready? First Amendment, the government can't take away your freedom of religion, speech, press, or assembly. Second Amendment, it can't take away your right to keep and bear arms. Third Amendment, it can't force you to let troops take over your house during peacetime. Fourth Amendment, they can't search you unreasonably. Fifth Amendment, they can't try you twice for the same crime, and you can't be forced to incriminate yourself, among other things. Sixth Amendment, you have a right to a speedy and public trial by a jury of your peers in criminal cases. Seventh Amendment says you have that same right in civil cases. Eighth Amendment, no cruel or unusual punishment or excessive bail. And the Ninth Amendment says that, hey, there are other liberties too, even if we didn't mention them here. But it's another amendment, the 14th, that's actually the most important for this unit, because it fundamentally changed our interpretation of the Bill of Rights. The 14th Amendment has a due process clause, which said that states can't take away a person's life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And anyway, about 50 years later, this gives birth to something known as selective incorporation, which is the application of the Bill of Rights to the states on a case-by-case basis. Today, nearly the entire Bill of Rights has been incorporated, so it now restricts state governments, just like the federal government, from violating those fundamental rights. Now let's get into more detail on some of those amendments. Okay, the First Amendment's freedom of religion is actually broken into two parts. First is the Establishment Clause. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, so no official religion, but also nothing to help or harm religions. In Engel versus Vitale, the court struck down state-sponsored prayer in public schools, holding that it violated the Establishment Clause by promoting religious belief. The free exercise clause is the next part of that line. Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of a person's religion. So basically, Congress can't prevent you from practicing a religion, and in Wisconsin versus Yoder, they ruled that Amish families' free exercise rights were more important and outweighed the state's interest in mandating compulsory school attendance. And the court said, let there be homeschooling, and they saw that it was good. Okay, next up, my personal favorite, free speech. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Seems pretty clear to me, but apparently not to some people. Schenck versus U.S. was a World War I era case in which the court upheld a congressional law that prohibited speech intended to harm the war effort. Specifically, the court held that speech that creates a clear and present danger can be banned, and even though that part's no longer true, it's still important because it set the precedent that there can be time, place, and manner restrictions on speech. 50 years later in Tinker versus Des Moines, the court went the other way and extended free speech protection to students and teachers in public schools, ruling that symbolic speech like black armbands is pure speech and therefore constitutionally protected. On the other hand, defamatory or obscene speech may not be protected. The court usually rules in favor of free speech, and the same is true of freedom of the press. In New York Times versus U.S., the court bolstered freedom of the press, preventing the Nixon administration from blocking publication of classified documents, holding that there is a heavy presumption against prior restraint or censorship, even when national security is involved. So the Second Amendment underwent a major shift recently. In 2008, the court held that the Constitution established an individual right to bear arms, and then in McDonald versus Chicago, it incorporated that individual right to bear arms to the states, preventing them from violating that constitutional right. Alright, so that brings us to the Fourth Amendment, another favorite. Okay, so what's an unreasonable search? Basically, an officer needs to have a warrant, probable cause, or consent for a search. And according to the exclusionary rule, illegally obtained evidence cannot be used against you at trial. Then in the late 1960s, the court decided that people had to be informed of their Fifth and Sixth Amendment rights in what's become known as the Miranda Rule. You've heard it. You have the right to remain silent, you have the right to an attorney, yada, yada, yada. But there is an exception known as the public safety exception. And that says that even if the police haven't Mirandized a suspect yet, and they ask him a question during an active situation where the public could be in danger, that the suspect's answer can be used as evidence in trial. Additionally, in Gideon versus Wainwright, the court incorporated the Sixth Amendment's guarantee of the right to counsel, forcing states to provide defendants with an attorney if they can't afford one. Not a ton to say about the Eighth Amendment. Obviously, the death penalty is currently still allowed, so it's not viewed as cruel or unusual punishment, but some forms of the death penalty have been struck down, as well as things like who can receive it or for what crimes. One of the big picture themes for this whole section is the attempt to balance individual freedom with public order and safety. Some court decisions move us towards more freedom, while others go the other way towards safety. But it's a trade-off because then we're giving up some freedom. But we still have one more thing left in civil liberties. Remember the Ninth Amendment says that there are unenumerated rights that belong to the people? Well, in 1965, the court officially decided that privacy is one of those rights. And then in 1973 in Roe v. Wade, the court held that the right of privacy covers a woman's decision to have an abortion. In more recent cases, though, the court has recognized that the states may have an interest in regulating and restricting abortion, however. Keep your eyes peeled, by the way, for a major court ruling on this issue later this year. Okay, so now we're shifting over to civil rights. Civil rights protect people from discrimination based on group characteristics like race, national origin, religion, and sex. The 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause is often seen as the constitutional basis for lots of civil rights legislation, since it basically told states they couldn't treat people differently under the law. We can view Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail as a call to fulfill the inclusive promises of the Declaration of Independence when it said all men are created equal, and the preamble of the Constitution when it declared that this government was being established by we the people. Within civil rights, we can think of the 1960s Civil Rights Movement for rights for Black Americans and the Women's Rights Movement. Additional movements include the pro-life movement as well as the LGBTQ rights movement, which have each enjoyed various levels of success at different levels of government. Brown v. Board of Education declared that race-based segregation in public schools was an unconstitutional violation of the Equal Protection Clause. This was followed a decade later by the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a landmark piece of legislation that banned discrimination in employment and public accommodations on the basis of race, color, national origin, religion, or sex. The following year, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 banned literacy tests and other obstacles to vote, and this led to a dramatic increase in minority voter turnout. The women's rights movement saw success with the Civil Rights Act, as well as the Equal Pay Act of 1963, which did what the name suggests, and Title IX of the Educational Amendments Act of 1972. Basically, this law prohibited schools that take public money from engaging in sex discrimination. It's also important to point out that court cases and legislation haven't always expanded civil rights. An infamous 1896 ruling by the court upheld separate but equal as constitutional and ushered in 50 years of Jim Crow laws legalizing segregation in the South. And as we learned earlier, Shaw versus Reno, the court prohibited racial gerrymandering even if it's done with the specific purpose of increasing minority representation. Another modern corollary to this is affirmative action, which refers to policies that require businesses and colleges to take active steps to increase the hiring and admission of racial minorities, most commonly Black and Hispanic Americans. As this video is being recorded, affirmative action is still constitutional, though it's been somewhat limited, but the debate rages on. On the one hand, some say the Constitution is colorblind, and therefore any distinction based on race is automatically unconstitutional. The other side says no, it's race conscious and only forbids racial classifications that are intended to harm minorities, not ones designed to help. And Unit 3 ends on that cheery note. On to Unit 4. Pause the video, splash some water in your face, do another shot of 5-hour energy, do what you gotta do. But let's keep going. Unit 4 is American political ideologies and beliefs and is mercifully a short unit. So once upon a time there's America, and some Americans are conservative, some are liberal, and others are libertarian. And there's even people who aren't any of those, but the AP exam doesn't care about them, so neither do we. But the basic idea is that there are certain core values shared by Americans like individualism, equality of opportunity, free enterprise, rule of law, and limited government. And while there's broad agreement in these basic concepts, people of different ideologies interpret them differently. A political ideology is a consistent set of beliefs about the purpose and scope of government. So let's talk about and massively oversimplify our big three. Conservatives typically like economic freedom, low taxes, less regulation, and less government effort in promoting social and economic equality. But they favor a stronger government when it comes to defense, police, and law enforcement, and often favor restrictions on things like abortion, same-sex rights, and marijuana. Liberals or progressives are basically the opposite. They prefer more economic regulation, higher taxes, and for more services to be provided by governments, especially in areas like healthcare and education. They prefer a smaller role for government in defense and policing, and prefer to protect the rights of the accused in favor of personal privacy like reproductive rights and sex equality. Libertarians are the easiest to summarize and caricature. Freedom good, government usually bad. Basically, they favor maximum social and economic freedom and argue for a very limited role for government, sticking to things like protecting private property and individual rights. To them, government is a necessary evil, but should be kept as small as possible. The Republican Party's platform aligns more closely to conservative positions, while the Democratic Party's platform aligns more closely to liberal positions. Shocking, I know. But remember not to mix up party and ideology. They're not interchangeable on the AP test. And just for fun, real quick, let's throw in two economic ideologies. Why not? Keynesians argue that when the economy is in a recession, the government should increase spending to stimulate the economy, while supply-side economists argue that the better move is to cut taxes. Government tax and spending policy is known as fiscal policy, as you might remember from Unit 2, but the Federal Reserve can do something called monetary policy instead. Monetary policy influences the money supply and interest rates, and when the economy is in a recession, the response is to increase the money supply and lower interest rates. When the problem is high inflation, decrease the money supply and raise interest rates. Okay, but how do people end up with a particular ideology? Well, our term for that is political socialization, which refers to the process by which people obtain their ideology. Families, schools, friends, media, religious organizations are all part of the process, with family being the most significant source of political socialization. Additionally, there are generational effects. Younger generations like millennials and zoomers are more liberal than older generations like boomers. Now, this is not to be confused with life cycle effects, which refers to how people's ideology evolve over the course of their own lifetime, including the issues they believe are most relevant. There's also something called the impressionable age hypothesis, which suggests that major political events that occur early in life can have a lasting impact on a person's ideology. Okay, next up is public opinion. Let's start with types of polls. An opinion poll is exactly what it sounds like, a poll that seeks people's opinions on various topics. A benchmark poll is typically administered when a person is thinking about officially becoming a candidate in an election to help them understand how they're perceived by the public. Tracking polls usually ask the same group of people a question like a presidential approval over a set of months to see fluctuations in their response. And entrance-exit polls are conducted on election day with actual voters and help to predict the outcome before the votes are actually counted. To be scientifically valid, polls must have random samples in which all members of the population have an equal chance of being selected. It also must be stratified, meaning that the sample reflects characteristics of the population. And since they're only using a sample of the population, there will be a sampling error, meaning that some of the results are just chance variation and therefore aren't perfectly accurate. Getting within about a 3% margin of error is viewed as acceptable. Focus groups are smaller and aren't scientific, but they allow respondents to share more detailed, in-depth responses so they can be useful to campaigns. And that's Unit 4. Hang in, you've almost made it. Last up, Unit 5, political participation, and it's a doozy. To begin with, let's review voting rights real quick. States are in charge of elections, but a series of constitutional amendments have expanded voting rights. The 15th Amendment says that race can't be a barrier to voting. The 19th says that sex isn't a barrier to voting either. The 26th Amendment says that age can't be a barrier for anybody at least 18. And the 24th Amendment banned poll taxes in 1964. Okay, so now we know who can vote, but how can we explain people's voting behavior? We have 4 models of voting behavior to help us do that. Party line voting is super simple. The person votes for all the candidates from a single party. All she needs to know is who's a Democrat or who's the Republican, and that's it. Retrospective voting is voting based on whether you think that the incumbent candidate and party are doing well and therefore should be re-elected or not. On the other hand, prospective voting is voting based on the future and which candidate you prefer for the issues that the country could face going forward. And lastly, rational choice voting is voting based on what's in your individual best interest, like an old person voting for a candidate who promises to expand Social Security. And then there's the issue of people actually showing up and voting. At one level, this can be as simple as whether a person has strong political efficacy, the belief that her vote matters and that she can influence policy. There are also structural barriers, like the requirement in most states that voters must register before the election, and there may be more or fewer options when it comes to early voting and mail-in voting depending on your state. Additionally, there are lots of elections in the US, so turnout is highest for presidential elections and lowest for midterm and primaries. And there are certain demographic characteristics that are more correlated with engagement and voting as well. People with higher levels of education, higher income, middle-aged and older people, as well as religious people are each more likely to vote. Then there are the factors that influence which party a person votes for, and we have 5 of them to consider here. The best predictor of how a person will vote is party identification. Not surprisingly, people who identify with a party vote overwhelmingly for that party. Similarly, ideology influences voter choice, as does religious affiliation, gender, race, ethnicity, and other demographic characteristics. Additionally, candidate characteristics like their personality, whether they're perceived as trustworthy, that kind of thing matter, as do contemporary political issues, especially for retrospective voters. Alright, with that out of the way, the rest of the unit focuses on 4 pivotal linkage institutions that connect people to the government: political parties, interest groups, elections, and the media. First up, parties. Parties bring together people who have similar political beliefs and try to gain power and win elections. That's their main purpose: gain power. There are a handful of functions of parties as they work to accomplish this goal. They mobilize and educate voters, meaning they try to convince people to vote for their party's candidate, and then they work to make sure that people actually go to the polls and vote. Every 4 years, parties adopt a platform which lays out the beliefs, goals, and positions of the party. Parties also recruit candidates to run for office, trying to find people who they believe can win elections since, like we said, that's their fundamental purpose. Additionally, parties help with campaign management and do things like raise money and develop a coherent media strategy to benefit the candidates and the party. But parties change and adapt, and both major parties have been undergoing significant changes in the recent past. One change is the rise of candidate-centered campaigns, where the candidates have a passionate following, an appeal that's separate from their identity as a member of the party. Additionally, big changes to campaign finance laws have empowered candidates to be their own person and to be less reliant on the party for fundraising. Additionally, parties have changed to appeal to their demographic coalitions, and we've seen the Republican Party remade in the image of Trump, and the Democratic Party lurch further to the left to disenchanted progressives. Lastly, there was a major regional realignment of the late 60s to 1990s, which saw the South shift from being overwhelmingly Democratic to being reliably Republican. Over the last 3 decades or so, the US has been experiencing a party de-alignment as more people choose to be independent or no party affiliation, leaving the 2 major parties. While it's true the US has a 2-party system, there are other parties referred to as third parties. And there are both formal and informal obstacles to third-party success. Formal barriers include how elections are currently run, and they disadvantage anybody that isn't a Democrat or Republican. Something like winner-take-all voting districts that only reward the candidate who comes in first place in that district, which is obviously very rare for third-party candidates. There are also informal barriers they face, like the lack of media attention and fundraising, and the fact that many people feel like they'd be wasting their vote if they actually voted for them. Additionally, sometimes a major party incorporates a popular part of the third party's agenda if it's getting popular, and this is bittersweet for the party. They're influencing policy, but they aren't going to benefit politically from it by gaining power. Another linkage institution that connects people to policymaking is interest groups. And there are thousands of interest groups, and they vary tremendously, but we most often focus on groups that attempt to influence a narrow area of policy, for example, gun rights or women's reproductive rights. Purpose: influence policy. Good. Next, how do they do it? Well, functions include educating voters and office holders, lobbying, drafting legislation, mobilizing membership to pressure representatives to vote for or against a piece of legislation. Lobbying is when the interest group hires someone to directly pressure a member of Congress, often providing her with information to convince her to vote a certain way, and may even be able to help draft legislation, being in the room where it happens, suggesting the wording of a bill. Some interest groups are also able to exert influence by working with bureaucratic agencies and congressional committees in relationships known as iron triangles or issue networks. This is basically a symbiotic relationship where they each help each other out. Now, the thing is, there is significant inequality of political and economic resources. Said another way, some interest groups are really powerful and others not so much, and so they have unequal access to decision makers. Big, strong, well-funded groups have more access than smaller groups. And there are also social movements, as discussed earlier, which attempt to impact society and policymaking. These are often more organic and decentralized, which can affect their effectiveness. Okay, hang in people, we're almost there. Next up, elections, and I'll try not to give anybody 2016 or 2020 PTSD. But that said, let's start with presidential elections. There's a lot to get to here, so let's go. To get the nomination, a candidate has to win her party's nomination, which means winning a majority of delegates at the national convention. They win delegates by winning primaries and caucuses in different states. Some states have open primaries, which are elections that any registered voter can participate in, while other states have closed primaries, which only allow registered party members to participate. Still, other states have something known as a caucus, which isn't really so much an election as much as a meeting of party members where they vote and publicly decide to eliminate candidates until they have a winner. Next comes the general election, where the winner gets to be president. To win, the candidate needs a majority of the electoral votes, currently 270. The nationwide popular vote doesn't matter. Rather, candidates focus on winning individual states. For example, whichever candidate wins Florida in 2024 will receive 30 electoral votes. Now, because 48 states are winner-take-all, it doesn't matter whether they win by 1 vote or by a million, they get all the electoral votes. This causes candidates to focus primarily on swing states, which are states that are competitive and ideally have larger amounts of electoral votes. The more the better. I don't need to tell you that the current setup is just a little controversial and makes a great essay prompt. Modern campaigns have become much longer, with very long 2+ year election cycles becoming the norm. The amount of money being spent on campaigns has skyrocketed, and in turn the amount of time and effort spent fundraising has also risen dramatically. Campaigns have become more and more reliant on social media and attempt to go viral in efforts to connect with younger voters. Candidates have also become very dependent on professional consultants to manage and run campaigns. Another major topic is campaign finance, so here's the quick and dirty version. In 2002, Congress passed the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, which banned soft money, among other things. Soft money refers to money contributed to a political party, and it was basically seen as a loophole because there are hard limits on how much you can give to a candidate, so instead give it to the party, and then the party gives it to the candidate. So this law banned that. But the Supreme Court in Citizens United versus FEC struck down that ban, allowing soft money once again. But the court also held that political spending by corporations and labor unions is a form of protected speech under the First Amendment. This led to the creation of super PACs. A regular PAC, or political action committee, is an organization that raises money to support a campaign and mostly spends that money independently of the candidate herself. With super PACs, they can only spend the money independently. The other difference is that corporations and labor unions can only give to super PACs, not to regular PACs. And finally, the media. Not much here, good news. Basically, there's been huge changes over time about how people get their news. From newspapers to radio to TV to cable TV to internet and now social media. One main role of the media is to act as a gatekeeper, choosing what to report on, thus affecting what people know about and what they think is important. The watchdog role refers to investigative journalism, where they're supposed to keep public figures accountable. And then there's the scorekeeper role, typified by horse race journalism, which follows polling results and threatens to turn elections into popularity contests instead of reporting on, the qualifications and platforms of the candidates. There are more media choices than ever before right now, but that doesn't necessarily mean people are better informed. There's been a sharp rise in ideologically oriented programming, which basically gives the slanted version of the news that their audience wants to hear, as well as consumer-driven media outlets that care more about views, clicks, and engagement than in making sure that people are actually, well informed. And then there's the problem where people are sometimes unsure about the credibility of news sources and the information that's being presented. And on that kind of bleak note, you've survived. This has been a The Money production. I'm exhausted. I can't believe you made it this far. If you're hearing me right now, I pretty much guarantee you're passing this test. If you're about to walk in and take it right now, I wish you all the best. Trust me, you got this.